This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast about all things innovation in the people space. I'm Kyle Rode. Let's start the show. Welcome back, Rebel HR community. This is going to be a fun one today. With us, we have Dr. Britt Yamamoto. He is the author of the book that is available now where books are sold. Really excited to dig into it. The book is called The Soil of Leadership, Cultivating the Conditions for Transformations. Britt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the pod, and really excited to dig into this today. So, I'm really fascinated to dig into this topic because it's a little bit of a different slant on leadership than you would find in many of the books that you read in school or that you would find, shiny on a bookshelf. So I'm fascinated to understand what motivated you to write this book, The Soil of Leadership.
Well, I first want to acknowledge that you've done an excellent job of using the metaphor by saying that we're going to dig into this right away.
I got dad jokes for days, man.
Setting that up, right? We'll do our best not to use too many of those in this conversation. So in many ways, the book itself is a culmination and a memorialization of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 decades with leaders all around the world. So I've been doing leadership development now with leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and over the last 5 to 8 years, more in North America. And through that leadership development work, bringing forward a lot of my experience farming and learning about sustainable farming and using a lot of those stories and those metaphors to speak to some of the leadership development approach that myself and my organizations take, which is very much an inside-out approach to leadership, so to speak. So maybe I can just start with just sort of a quick story about what I mean when I say the soil of leadership. So this idea comes from my very first experience in learning about farming. So I did not know much about farming growing up. I grew up in Southern California in a beach community where really, if we were talking about growing anything, it was probably the only thing that was, being grown was, well, at least at that time, illegal and grown in people's, farmers. But
I think our listeners can probably fill in the blank.
You probably can fill in the blank, especially if you live along the west coast of the United States. But did not grow up in an agricultural community. However, my grandparents were on both sides were farmers, as many first generation immigrants, at least at that time, would be in the U.S. And so while I was sort of not growing up around it, I sort of had it around me, which is to say, too, that for many grandchildren, certainly, if not children of farmers, it is very uncommon for, especially if they are a small farmer, especially if they're an immigrant farmer, to want their children or their grandchildren to become small farmers as well, right? That's the sacrifice that's made toiling in the sun and in the earth is not to sort of perpetuate that very difficult life. So all of that's to say, I did not grow up around agriculture, but as a young adult, I realized at that time that I needed to learn about farming. A sort of short story of it is that I was very involved in ecological education. I wanted to use our relationship to the natural world to provide and facilitate transformational education at that time for kids. But I realized that I didn't know anything about farming, which in many ways sits at the very core of that relationship between our humans and the natural world. So short story is that I traveled to Japan, actually for the very first time, to go live on a sustainable farm there in the southern island of Kyushu. And I say it was my first time, which technically is not true because I was actually born there, but my parents were only there for about 6 months before they returned to the US, and where I was raised in California. So it was both sort of a homecoming in some ways, but also in more important ways, it was for me to understand and to learn about farming. So I went there with very little experience. Fast forward, and of course the story itself is sort of articulated in a little bit more detail in the book itself. But fast forward, my very first morning on the farm, the main farmer brought me to the field, to the middle of the field. And this was October in Japan, and the fields were just exploding with color and food and taste, and it was just amazing. And he said to me, or he asked me this question, which would effectively change the whole trajectory of my life at that time personally, but then certainly professionally. And that question was, what's the difference between a conventional farmer and a sustainable farmer? So what's the difference between a conventional farmer and a sustainable farmer? And this was me in my early 20s. So I had all of the, the book answers and all of what I believed to be the right answers. And being a very patient man, he let me finish and said, well, those things all may be true, but what you really need to understand is the difference is that a conventional farmer grows plants and a sustainable farmer, they grow soil. And that is the difference. And so, of course, I would go on to farm for about 6 more years. And that framework was very helpful in understanding what I was doing as an actual farmer. And it wouldn't be until later as I would go on to build my own organizations and businesses and work more with leaders around the world and helping them to lead their organizations and businesses more effectively, that I began to see that actually the metaphor was just as resonant when we think about our organizational life. So if you think about what it means to grow plants, you're focused on the short term, you're focused on what you can see, and it leads you to make certain decisions, and it leads you to look at the world in a particular way, right? And what are you doing when you grow soil? Well, you're thinking about the roots. You're thinking in many ways of what you can't see. So you're living into a different kind of imagination, right? And you're thinking about the long term. So it's a very simple framework, but it's one of these sort of nexus events where once you start down that path, it leads you to start asking questions and look at the world in a very different way, right? So, so in many ways, what the soil of leadership is, it's our building on that very simple yet powerful framework of what does it mean for us in our organizations and our businesses and the way in which we organize ourselves to be looking at things from a soil-based perspective, right? And especially, I know so many of your listeners are working in the field of HR, and what does it mean to look at the kind of cultures that we're creating as we are cultivating soil, where so much of our work drives us to think about, and to be very clear, like farmers can't just grow soil; they need to grow plants too, right? So it's very much a both and proposition.
Yeah.
But what does it mean for us to think and then, of course, practice along those lines, right? So that very much is the essence of the soil leadership. And so what really, to come to your question in this very obtuse way, is to say that to see how this particular metaphor, and of course there are others that are drawn from this as well, but how this particular metaphor is so resonant, and not just in a North American HR context, but within a social movement organization in the DR Congo, or within a small business in India, or you name it. It has this particular resonance where I'm happy to talk a little bit more about why I think that's the case, but it lands in a way that people just understand. So Anyway, long answer to your first question. Yeah.
No, I love it, and I love the imagery that evokes, and I think really I love that. I love that metaphor, that tie-in between the sustainability versus soil versus plants. Side note: my grandparents were farmers too, but I'm an Iowa kid, so
Great.
so a lot of growing plants. But it's, it's funny because it still always comes back to the soil. It really does, because it's like, even like the price per acre, it's all about which type of soil. And then you can get down to there's all these different types of soils and name. And what's interesting is, so I'm going to nerd out for a second. Like those soils come from the like decomposing roots of the plants that were there before. Right. And it's it's these prairie plants that like the universe gifted to us where we live. And that is now the medium that we have the opportunity to grow abundance from. Right. But it so speaks to what I think many of us are trying to do. And quite frankly, many people are looking for, whether it's in your family, in your organization, in your community, like you're looking for an environment to thrive, right? Like an environment to grow, an environment to bloom.
That's right.
We can keep going on these we can keep going with these like tie-ins.
The metaphors are endless.
The metaphors are everywhere. So with that framing and context, I think it's a really, really, really great lead in into, why is this so important to be focused on versus, I would argue, much of the focus as we look at like leadership development and organizational development is it is on the plants, right? It's on the short term, visible, surfacey stuff. Why is it so important to focus on the environment and the soil of
it's in many ways it's the sort of the pragmatic question, right? Like it's like, well, it's great, like it's a really beautiful story, but like, why is this important? I say this both with my experience of building and leading organizations and also sort of working with people who are doing that. And I think in many ways it's important because we, and I say that in the sort of, broadest sense, are kind of done with these conventional forms of leading and organizing ourselves. They just are not working. And I, while it's very easy to sort of lob that critique, and it's, much different than thinking about how you actually build something, right? At the same time, I think that we need new stories, which is to say we need new stories about how we organize ourselves, how we're creating the cultures that we're doing the work in, how we want to relate to each other in those spaces, right? And my experience is that is not the realm of technical fix, which is, especially in my experience in like sort of the HR space, it's like we are inundated with technical fixes, right? Here's a new process or a new technique that's going to help build trust, or here's going to, trust is the most important thing, or vulnerability is the most important thing. And, I'm not, sounds like I'm, casting aspersions at those, and I think we know a lot of the big names who speak on those terms. But, if we use the plant soil metaphor, those are just plant orientation things. And if you don't have the soil to sustain those plants to grow, then you're just going to have to add implements and, external inputs to prop them up. Right. And so it's almost like we're not going to incrementally get there, but we also have to create a transition bridge to get there. So if we look at farming, when you take over a field, if it's been grown on conventionally, before you can certify that as organic, there's usually like a 3-year period where it's a transition period, where if you're seeking to farm that organically, or at least certify it as organic, there's remediation, there's things you have to do. It's a different kind of short-term thing where you have to sort of like feed the soil. You have to think about cover cropping. You have to think about ways that will help you to get there. But if you just go cold turkey and try to like farm sustainably in soil that's been effectively dirt, which is to say it's denuded of any kind of holding or nutrient, you're not going to be able to do anything, right? And so I think a lot of in our organizational life, we have like these great plants that if, again, like we're using the metaphor, like they're heirloom, beautiful, tasting, all these things, then we put into this dirt and there's nothing there. We have this amazing tool about how we're going to create a trusting team that people are going to open up and be vulnerable. And then we plop it into our work culture and it just wilts away and dies. And we ask, or we maybe say like, oh, well, that tool was a waste of time. That was stupid. But then realizing like just there was nothing, there's no holding media in it to actually like support the growth of that thing. Right. And so I think it's that I'm sure your listeners are familiar with like adaptive leadership as a framework and just like technical fixes versus adaptive challenges and just being able to see things as messy, thorny versus like, oh, we can like fine tune around the edges. Right. So anyway, that's kind of all over the place. But I think what it comes down to is I think that we need new stories before we implement new strategies.
So I love that. And, you know, as I'm listening to that, there's, you know, and I'm sure many of our listeners probably had the same experience where like, I'm just thinking through all of these, what I call like flavor of the month programs, right? It's like, here we go, mission accomplished. We've got this new tool. It's quote AI enabled, and it's going to help us make sure that we recognize effectively and build trust effectively. And, you know, all these programmatic, you know, solutions. But if you don't have this environment, or in this case, the soil, for that to thrive, for that to actually take root, it just fizzles out. It is and then what happens for an HR professional or any leader, for example, is you become known as this big talker, but there's no action behind it, right? Because it's you're just like throwing stuff out there, these programs that are supposed to fix everything, and you know, and then you have a pizza party and say we fixed it. Yeah. And then everybody's like, well, it still sucks. So that's right. You know, it's so, you know, I this is really resonating, you know, pretty deeply. I've always argued that, you know, HR's job is not to do HR really well. HR's job is to build an environment for the organization to do really well. Right. And so, and that's quite frankly, just through trial and error of, you know, frustration of doing the flavor of the month type stuff. That's right. So I'm curious, you know, what for those of us that are maybe having the light bulbs go off and they're like, okay, yeah, I get it. I need to do a cover crop before, you know, I roll out this next cool, exciting HR initiative. How should we be thinking about this in the context of how to kind of foundationally amend the culture so that it's ready to kind of accept the change that's necessary? Because by the way, I totally agree. Like the old paradigm of leadership is just not working. Like it works for a small a small minority of people. And I think it, you know, it's been effective at squeezing out profits and, you know, and things like that, but it's not working for everybody. Right. I don't think anybody disagree with that statement. So I'm curious, in your work, and, you know, you've done research on significant areas here. I'm curious what your perspective is on kind of how we should start to think about how to get there, how to amend the soil.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when I was posed this question about plants versus soil on the farm, and had that, you know, very deep learning around that, after a couple of weeks, inevitably I would ask the second question, which is, you know, sort of to what you're asking, which is like, okay, great. Like you grow soil, but like, how do you grow soil? What goes into growing soil, you know? And I had another sort of powerful framing that was, you know, reflected back to me, which is that it's a combination of time, space, and relationships. Time, space, and relationships. So that's what goes into building healthy soil on the farm. And I won't get into sort of like what that looks like on the farm, but if you think about some of the ways that we can and should be doing things a little bit differently, whether it's in our individual leadership or how we're even thinking differently about the teams and the ways that we're building culture. So time being the way in which, I don't have to say this to any HR professionals about, people feeling like their time is very, very filled up, right? There's sort of the bean counting approach to it and the efficiency and all of that. But even just that it's so oriented toward productivity, and the space to reflect, the space to slow things down, the space to discern, especially with the way in which information and stimulation comes at us with the velocity that it does. In many ways, the skills that we need now is how do you actually slow things down, and like, how do you sift through stuff? How do you actually develop the power of discernment, So reflective practice is one of the big parts around time. A space we talk about is spaciousness. So it's sort of the spaces in between things. And of course in the book, I get into this in more detail, but this different way of thinking about how we do things through a lens of almost like not doing, are those spaces in between. I know that sounds very abstract right now and sort of like in the interest of time, but the spaciousness as a frame of seeing that as, so if you think about it like in productivity, which we are so have it deeply internalized what productivity looks like. We have to be doing stuff, right? To fill up our calendar, we have to fill up our time. If we're not doing something, we're not productive. So much so that now, like if you create time for people to rest, if you create time for people to not do things, and you quote, even force them to do that, people see that as like, I'm not productive, right? And so I use the metaphor fallow as a way of talking about this in the book, so fallow being as a part of farming where you're taking a field and you're not planting in it for sort of like, to sell and market. So cover cropping or green manures or just letting your soil rest, right? And that was very hard for me to learn when I was farming, because I was like, you can't take that out of production. Like, what are we going to do? We're going to lose money. We're going to do all these things. And I saw that as being out of production, but it wasn't until I could see that actually that is an essential part of production. And my whole framing of production was what was getting in the way of me seeing that rest is production. So in the context of growing, letting that field rest allowed that field to produce. It wasn't a light switch going on or off. It was part of a system and a cycle of production. And so, yes, that is a metaphor. That's a framing. But our work is all about, those metaphors that we have about work, those metaphors we have about leadership, the metaphors we have about what it means to be productive, those all influence our practice. Those stories come from somewhere. And so when we work ourselves to the bone, or we think that we have to suffer, or that whatever, like, because maybe we have this idea of what it means to be a good worker is like really attached to this story of martyrdom or sacrifice, or like those are stories, but they deeply influence our practices, right? So it's like, that's why a lot of our work has really tried to even come back to that place of story where we need new stories to help us reframe our strategies. And there are some beautiful other stories out there. You don't have to only make it about farming and sustainable farming, but this has a way of landing that is not, it's not complicated. It's not intended to be obtuse. It's just intended to be like, hey, you don't have to like go and read all these, thousands of pages or, do all these things. It's just like, we need to shift our perspective. Right. And so, anyway, time, space. And then the last one is relationships. So it's relationship to self, relationship to others, relationship to our work. And, I'm sure for your listeners, like the piece around like self-awareness, the piece around intent versus impact, just a lot of the ways that we show up in the world. And, it's so funny that we think that we can work together easily when there's nothing more complicated than a human relationship. Like I have no idea there's nothing I can do that fully understand like how you see the world, right? And what motivates you and what, I can try and discern that, but So the idea that we just sort of gloss over that like, that relationships, which form the very foundation of our work, can be just sort of managed, I think is, again, like a bit of a sort of, it has its, I think, deep roots in some of the sort of Tayloristic ideas of production capitalism. But like, we don't have time to get into that in terms of human resources. But,
Yeah.
But I think, again, these are stories. These are stories about things.
Well, I love it. And, I mean, I'm here, like, there's just so much inherent truth in all of this. And, I think as we talk about, time, space, and relationships, and, I love that statement, the space to discern. And then as we talk about spaciousness and the space between, and the, the requirement of rest. And, I hadn't really thought about productivity in that context where, I mean, so many of us, it's like, well, I have 30 seconds free. I better respond to, I get through 3 emails? Can I get through 2? Yeah. But the reality is you might be better served to like take a breath, go get a hit of sunlight, and then come back and actually like effectively respond to the highest priority items. Right. And then, maybe those emails don't even matter anymore. But it is very much, it's the workplace is, and I think accelerated as we've got to more virtual workplaces, it's become so incredibly transactional that it is about every little ounce of productivity. But when you reframe productivity and you do that in the context of, well, you have to rest in order to produce, that's just a whole different way to think about it. And I think about it in the context of leadership and personal development, self-leadership.
That's right.
You can read all the self-help books you want. You can go to all the therapy you want. You can do all of it, but it doesn't actually stick unless you give it the time and space to stick.
That's right.
Right. Like, yeah, you grow through hard stuff, but you still have to have that spaciousness to reflect and move forward. Otherwise you just repeat patterns. Right.
Right.
So if you want to change and grow and do things differently, you have to have space. It doesn't work any other way. And so I'm like a big aha moment. Right. And I'm the first to admit that especially as a young leader, my assumption was, as a leader, the goal was just make sure everybody stayed really, really busy. Right. Just make sure let's just make sure everybody's plate's full so they can never blame me for not, but the reality is, giving people more space and there's all the buzzwords of empowerment, autonomy, you can throw whatever else you want. That actually, that allows for more growth. And quite frankly, it's a hell of a lot easier. So I appreciate that, but I love that framing. I think it's so incredibly important, I have to believe that this approach, it's to me, it's almost reminds me that, it's like the truth of being an organism on the planet Earth, right? Like, yes, we're human beings, but we're still of the earth, right? And we've got, we think we're drastically different than everything else. But the reality is that these metaphors of tending and growing plants, they do reflect the human experience, right? And these systems exist within a natural environment that I think a lot of times we ignore, especially in the world of business or organizations, or education for that matter. And so, what are some of the corollaries that we need to be thinking about as we kind of remember our connection to the planet and Mother Earth, and what would the takeaway be for our listeners that you'd like us to kind of maybe reflect on as we think about this and as we go and pick up this book?
Yeah. Well, there's an idea called biomimicry where, we sort of look to natural systems and the ways in which these natural systems have so much to teach us about ourselves and human systems and the various ways that we move through the world, right? And one of the reasons that I personally find so much value in drawing upon those things is it's very inherently humbling, right? It's to say that, and again, this is just for me, but the ways in which my head and my mind, my intellect gets in the way of some of the deeper purpose that I feel called to, whether it's do the work that I do or connect with people in the way I want to connect with, or to be able to share in this like uniquely remarkable human experience, that we were able to sort of articulate ourselves and share emotions and do all of these things that we do. And so I think it's not just like an intellectual enterprise to look at natural systems and say like, hey, that's the way it works in the world. But also to understand that there are these things that are so much, that have been going on, and they're so much, greater and more significant than, putting together our HR policy. But, I'm sure that will perhaps trigger a few people. But, again, I like to say that, we should engage in deeply serious work, but not take ourselves too seriously. And a lot of my work has been working with social justice leaders and movement builders over these past 2 decades too. So it's people who are like literally their lives are at risk and in danger as a result of the work that they are doing. And yet, right. And there's that, and yet. And so, yeah, I could go on and on about that, but I think it's not just the learning from natural systems. It's also that way in which it opens us up to a different way of being.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And biomimicry, that's a new one for me. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole tonight and totally nerd out, because this stuff is so, I do think, and I think some of it's come with age, some of it's come with experience, some of it's come with just questioning, why are we doing this? Why, why, and the kind of the very amateur study of human systems and organizational culture. And the reality is that so much of it is, just a reflection of the natural systems that we operate within. And there's a lot we can learn if we just slow down and listen a little bit. So, yeah. With that being said, I could keep going for hours and hours and hours. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to say we're just scratching the surface. We're just starting to get into the top soil here. I'm going to keep going with these.
There we go.
And so, again, I'm going to call out, I would encourage all our listeners, grab the book, The Soil of Leadership by Dr. Britt Yamamoto. Absolutely amazing conversation. I'm going to shift gears. We're going to go into the Rebel HR Flash Round. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Question number 1, where do we need to rebel?
Well, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think we need to reject our ideas of production, both as productive selves and productive systems. I'm not saying that production is not important, but I think the idea of what it means to produce is, again, it's deeply internalized through culture and, organizational structures and all of that. And I think in some ways that alone creates some of the problematic dynamics that exist within ourselves and within our work with others. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I love this. And so
I think we need to slow down. It's slowing down.
Yeah.
It's creating those spaces. It's resting. And, if you want to see rest as a rebellious act, which is kind of a ridiculous thing to sort of, that's where we're at. But take a nap, go for a walk.
Yeah.
And that's a radical act.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I just think that's that's such an important point to this conversation. And I guarantee you a lot of listeners are like, oh, there's no way, we look at like cost per hour and all this sorts of things.
Yeah.
I go back to, so my context is for-profit organizations. The goal of the organization is to make money, right? But you don't make money if you burn people out, run them off, you have high turnover rates, it's miserable to work there. People get hurt. And that happens when people are stressed out, they're not paying attention, they're unwell, they're not taking care of themselves and their mental health. They're not taking time off. The goal is to make profit. The goal is not to, to just count every last penny. That might not be the way to do it. And in the context of letting a field rest, that actually helps it be more profitable and productive long-term, right? Yeah. Sustainably.
And it is, and again, it's to not to suggest at all that these are simple issues that we're dealing with, right? They're thorny and complicated and contextual, and they're there for a reason. I firmly believe that some of these problems, or many of these problems that we exist, they're not bugs, they're features. The system is functioning in many ways exactly how it's supposed to function. So unless we very consciously shift those things, it's just, so that's why I say it's not a technical fix. We're not going to technically fix our way out of this thing because the system is working exactly like it's supposed to work. So
totally with you. Yeah. All right, we can keep going. This is supposed to be the flash round, so I got to go there.
Right.
Okay, question number 2. Who should we be listening to?
Not to be overly cute or anything, but I would say no one, which is to say that there's so much noise, and I don't mean that in a overly pejorative sense, but there's just so much stimulation that the opportunity to be still and silent is rare. And I think that takes practice. I think it takes discipline. I think it takes regularity, because there's so much to be found and to learn and to hear within those spaces. And they're not just silence. It's not blank space, So, I often, to be sort of a bit of a wise ass when I'm having these conversations, I'll be, why did you write this leadership book? And it's well, actually, I don't think the world needs another leadership book. It doesn't need another leadership guru. It doesn't need another leadership person out there telling you this is what you need to do, when it's just another form of repackage something. I had someone yesterday, actually, a friend in Sri Lanka, say they were talking about Simon Sinek, and they're he's just taking what Buddha and Christ and all these people have been saying for millennia and just reframing it as why or purpose. It's just really funny as a kind of thing, which and I was Sinek's work, but anyway, there's good stuff out there already. So I think it's what does it mean to actually take a step back from it.
I love it. And I think in the context of our conversation, that really, really poignant. And I do think that there's so much we can learn by listening and by trusting ourselves and our intuition, right? And this kind of goes back, not to get too woo-woo, but goes back to kind of believing that we are a part of a natural world, and that there's there are actually natural systems that we've kind of avoided listening to, that we should slow down and listen to as well. So, All right, last question. How can our listeners connect with you and get their hands on the book?
So there's a few different ways. You can, of course, go to any of the platforms where fine books are sold. There is, of course, the hardbound book, but there's also an audio book, which came out really nice. And I would highly recommend that as well, as a something that you can walk around with. Also, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and particularly on those two platforms, I talk about the book, but I also talk about and share what I call fallow time. We talked a little bit about fallow earlier, and so you can see some of the ways in which I practice fallow. But well-being is also a big part of our work and a big part of the soil of leadership approach, and sort of practicing well-being, and how does that show up, and how do we think and talk about it? So if you're curious about how I do that, you'll see that there as well. But those are the great ways to connect. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. We will have a link to that in the show notes. So open up your podcast player, click on in. Really looking forward to hearing the reaction off the book. Really wonderful conversation. I appreciate the reframing the approach, and I think this is a powerful conversation on leadership that reminds us kind of what matters and where the focus should be. So I really appreciate you putting the work here, and I'm looking forward to continuing to follow the work you continue to do, Britt. So thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Kyle. I appreciate it. And I think you and your listeners are doing important work out there and thinking about how we work together better as people. So ultimately, that's what all of our organizational life's about.
I love it. All right. Yep. Rebel on, Britt. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Kyle.
All right. That does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.